And let's see, we've got a little bit of time left. So I will go live on Facebook. I might do that a little bit early because I don't know what my computer is going to do. um, but yeah, so we'll do the intro, which is timed about 5 minutes. And then I'll run through pretty much the slides that you see that, that are up, and basically run through some instructions and then introduce you.
That's great. And I'm going to mention, I did put the slides because I just have a ton of resources. So you can still send them out and post them wherever you want to. I just did that to make sure, because people always like, could you add this? You mentioned this. And so I can just grow that list. So
totally fine. Yeah, usually I send in the post, I send a PDF of the slides, and I'll merge your slides and my slides. And then I usually do any extra, like a resource list that's maybe not on the slides or something like that. Cool. And then, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and.
All right, do your thing. I'll
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stonebelt ARC's webinar, Faith and Disability, Strategies for Helping Congregations Move from Exclusion to Embrace. And we have with us Dr. Erik Carter, and you'll hear more from him and about him here in a moment. So I want to tell you a little bit. I'm your host, Reverend Sarah McKenney. I am the spiritual support and volunteer coordinator for Stonebelt ARC. For those of you who may not know who we are, I know there's a lot of us a part of the Stonebelt community that are on this call. But for those of you who do not know who we are, Stonebelt is a nonprofit service provider that offers a wide range of support services for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, as well as neurodivergent folks. We are located in Bloomington, Bedford, and Columbus, Indiana, and serve the South Central Indiana region. We are a secular organization. So this means we strive to offer support to people of any and all faith traditions or spiritual practices. We are also a community-based organization. So this means that we promote full integration, inclusion, and belonging of people in their community. Now, before we dive in, I want to bring your attention to a few more things that are on your screen. Please notice the donation site at the bottom of this screen. I will also put that in the chat box here in a moment. We are offering our webinars for free, but we want to be able to bring you quality speakers. So we do ask you to consider making a donation today. This is the fourth of 5 webinars in the 2022 calendar year. We have 3 others that are recorded and on our website. So please check those out. This webinar will be recorded and archived on our website as well. So feel free to share this webinar with others, check out what we already have, and please do that. We also have on our website some other resources and material available to you all. So some books, some articles, stuff like that. So please also check that. And that's an ever-changing and growing and developing site. So check back often. Like I said, so just to give you a few reminders, I know each time we use Zoom, there might be slightly different things available and tools available to you. So I do want you all to know that your microphones are muted upon entering and throughout the webinar. However, you can use the chat function, which will be an icon, kind of looks like a speaking bubble. You can use that to type in who you are, where you're from, why you're here, and use that as a networking tool. And then you can also use the Q&A option for any questions that you might have. I know Erik plans to check that throughout the webinar and trying to answer those along the way. If Erik or I are not able to answer your questions during the webinar, we will make our emails available to you all at some point. I will say in about 2 weeks after this webinar, you all will get a follow-up email. In that email, you will get a link to this recorded webinar. You will also get a link to our website. And then you will also have the PDF version of the slides that you see today. And then we'll also give you a bonus resource of a list of extra resources that Erik will provide you as well. So please check that out. And on that email, I can give you Dr. Erik and I's email as well to follow up with any questions. now, without further ado, I introduce to you Erik Carter. He is a Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Special Education at Vanderbilt University. He has his PhD from Vanderbilt University. And I just got switched. There we go. He spent much of his time doing research, teaching on these such research topics, such as strategies of promoting full participation, belonging, and valued roles in school, work, community, and congregation settings, so faith communities. And you may have already read some of his work, as he is widely published. His name is, has been a part of writing 7 books and 250 articles and chapters. So if you haven't read him, if you start looking around on the topic of disability and inclusion and spirituality, you will quickly find his name. Welcome, Erik. I could keep going, but welcome. And we're so happy to have you here.
Well, thank you, Sarah. My deep gratitude, of course, goes to you and also to Stonebelt ARC for putting this wonderful webinar series on. It's really good to be part of it. Always good to be pleasure to be with all of you as well this afternoon, and to be among direct support providers and families and faith community leaders and professionals and a few advocates and instigators too, who I know care deeply about the flourishing of people with disabilities in all aspects of their life. And so, like many of you, I also envision that our faith communities will be places in which believing and belonging abound together, without asterisks, no exceptions. And so I'd like in our hour together to be able to offer some reminders and maybe some fresh insights into what it might take to move faith communities beyond the veneer of inclusion and towards this place of deep belonging and embrace. You might notice I've changed the subtitle a little bit to the webinar to supporting inclusion and belonging from both sides of the door. And you'll see why I say that in just a moment, both sides of the door. And this is because we're bringing together multiple perspectives into this conversation. Those of you who work within our service systems, like organizations and direct support providers, who are really striving to help people with developmental disabilities live good and enviable lives in their community. But then there's those of you who serve within our faith communities, like clergy and ministry leaders and others, who are striving to widen their welcome in ways that lead to inclusion and belonging. And of course, there are individuals with developmental disabilities and their families whose lives involve trying to pass through both of these doors, however inaccessible they often tend to be. And so I'm certain this requires tackling a little bit too much in my short time with you. There are things that I'll put in the slides that I won't discuss fully, but you'll find those in the handouts that will be posted already online on the link that I just put in chat, or that Sarah will put in chat for me as well, and I'll come back to these. So everything that you see, you can download and read later as well. I just want to spur your own thinking about how we collectively work across our entire communities to promote the flourishing of people with disabilities in their faith, in their friendship, and in every way that we know matters most. So let's go ahead and get started. And as a researcher, I guess I should say I am a researcher. I also co-direct a Vanderbilt Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. But one strain of my work, as Sarah referenced, involves studying faith and flourishing in the lives of children and adults with disabilities, as well as the postures and the practices of congregations and communities that either embrace or exclude them. And so I want to share a snapshot of what we've been learning through our research and our partnerships with churches around the country about, first, the changing landscape of disability ministry, but second, about actually changing that landscape. So my research is primarily focused on the church, though I think you're going to see that the patterns I discuss really do have salience across other religious traditions as well. And now my accent is going to be on the more than 7 million or so people with intellectual disability in the US, for whom faith communities still struggle to welcome and weave them in all they do. But there are themes here that are going to relate to the 1 in 4 Americans who have other experiences of disability, those 60 million plus individuals. So before addressing those postures and practices that you might adopt, I just want to drive home something that I think is really important and is maybe something that we would already affirm. Studies certainly confirm this as well, that faith has an important and even a prominent place in the lives of many people with developmental disabilities and their families, just like anyone else. There's no difference in the percentage of people with and without significant disabilities who consider their faith to be somewhat or very important in their lives. So there's no difference there. In fact, we've interviewed many youth and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, much like you probably have, about the place and prominence of faith in their lives. And what you find is, like anyone else, they want to know and be known by God, to love and to be loved by their neighbors, to serve and to be served by others, to discover and live out their calling. And like anyone else, they also want to explore and share and deepen their faith in the midst of a caring and committed community, just like anyone else. So in one of our studies, we asked parents of nearly 500 youth and young adults with intellectual disability or autism about the extent to which they agree with 5 statements regarding their child's faith. Does their child pray daily? 56% of parents said that's true. They look to their faith as providing meaning and purpose in their life. That was true for 57% of parents who said that about their sons and daughters. They consider themselves to be active in a faith community or congregation. They enjoy being around those who share their faith. Their faith impacts many of their decisions. And if you looked across all 5 of these areas, you'd find that 80% of families agreed or strongly agreed that at least one of these statements applied to their sons and daughters with complex communication needs or significant cognitive disabilities. In our own state, we just did a survey just a little while ago and we found that 74% of people with disabilities in Tennessee said that their being part of a faith community was somewhat or very important. Now, these numbers change a little bit when we think about people with greater support needs or who also are on the autism spectrum or whose parents have lower sort of faith is less important to their parents. So again, if you want to read about any of the things I'm going to put, you'll find the links in what Sarah already posted, or she will post if it hasn't shown, where the slides are. You can read about each of these more deeply. But my point is that that desire to be part of a faith community seems to stand in contrast with actual participation. Our latest look at the National Core Indicators, which is a wonderful source of information about community involvement for adults served in the IDD systems, 59% of adults with intellectual disability did not go to religious services or spiritual practices in the last month. And that was only 52% 5 years earlier. That's sadly the only measure of spirituality that we have in this national data set. But what we also find is that the numbers are even higher in people living in group homes and supported living contexts versus living with their families. So it becomes less and less likely that you'll be part of a faith community. So for individuals with disabilities, this matters like it would for anyone else. It's also true for their families and parents. A similar portrait of relevance and importance comes from our studies of parents and other family members. Their beliefs and their faith community involvement help them cope with stressors. It provides a framework for understanding disability. It offers a sense of direction. It can give strength for meeting everyday challenges. It shapes actually their decisions about services and connects them to a whole array of social and practical and emotional and spiritual supports. So if you look at the same 5 questions I showed you earlier, this time parents talking about themselves, parents of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they say heavily, they pray daily, they look to their faith as providing meaning and purpose. They are active in a faith community. They enjoy being around others who share their faith, and their faith affects their decisions. And all of this matters because for people with disabilities and their families, we find over and over that greater agreement on the questions that you see up on your screen lead to greater levels of quality of life and family quality of life. So there's good things that come from these connections and these beliefs. And yet, in contrast to all of that importance, we, in a partnership with Melinda Alt at the University of Kentucky, in a study, we found that 1 in 3 parents had left their congregation because their child wasn't welcomed or included. I share all this because the absence of a faith, absence from a faith community is not due to the absence of faith. There are other things that are standing in the way. So when you step back and look at what research and practice tells us, it's what we should already know firsthand, but this is so important for those of us in the service system. Spirituality does have relevance in the lives of many people with disabilities and their families. And it can also not just have relevance, but considerable importance. Sometimes it's of principal importance. But it's also expressed and experienced in widely different ways. There are so many variations in people's spiritual practices that you can't predict that in advance based on a disability label. And that spirituality changes over time. It's not always the same, as it isn't for anyone. And so we have to revisit this periodically. And fifth, spirituality can actually be highly influential in the lives of adults with disabilities and their families. For all the reasons I mentioned before, it determines their goals and priorities. It defines their quality of life. It helps them relate to others. It organizes daily experiences, and it shapes who they affiliate with and the decisions that they make. So we know that it can lead to overall well-being and certainly life satisfaction. But what's different, the first five are true of anyone. The sixth point relates specifically to those with developmental disabilities because in this case, most individuals are going to require some amount of support to participate fully in the spiritual practices and religious activities they value most. So what does all this mean for those of us who are working within disability service systems or are working within local faith communities? And let me share, to illustrate this, 5 kind of portraits of community that have kind of been prominent over the last 40 or 50 years of our history. But I want to do this, some of you have heard me talk about this, but I want to do it from 2 lenses. From the lens of the communities that service systems are trying to open up, but also from the lens of faith communities that are trying, hopefully, to do the same. And what you're going to see is what I share isn't actually past history, it's actually living history. And you'll see examples of these 5 portraits side by side in your town, in your city, in your region, in your state. There's a stickiness to these portraits that we have to work on getting unstuck. And we'll start with the exclusion. At the time I was born, almost 50 years ago, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities were so often excluded from so many aspects of community life. That was a time when they were denied access to local schools and often not in workplaces or neighborhoods, which meant there were holes in our communities and our communities were missing essential members. The same was also true in many local congregations. And I'm going to change the language here from exclusion to ministry apart from people with disabilities. So many of our neighbors who are impacted by disability may not have a presence in our worship services and religious education programs and service experiences and fellowship activities, the things that make up the life of a local community. And it begs the question, is this the portrait of community that you see in front of you in your community or even in your faith community as well? And the thing is that most congregations and most community programs would say they don't intentionally exclude people with developmental disabilities. But I think it's long ago choices and present day choices about where and how we gather as a community and end up inadvertently leading in that same direction of exclusion. It's the ways we build our buildings and spaces, the way we design those. It's about the expectations that we develop for behavior and participation, our approaches to preaching and teaching, and even the places that we gather and go. That speaks volumes about who we truly expect to be part of our faith community. And it makes statements about the boundaries of the body. So when we begin with a far too narrow vision of who might eventually show up into our faith communities, we limit inadvertently who might later come back. My point is that exclusion in many parts of our community and many of our faith communities is the natural outcome of unintentionality. Unintentionality leads to exclusion. And I think, when you think about the preparation that many clergy have in this area, it's often very limited. In one of our studies about 8 years ago, we looked at all of the theological schools in North America, and we asked leaders of those schools about the preparation that their graduates receive, future pastors and clergy members and priests and rabbis. And they said that only 29% of those seminary leaders said that their graduates were adequately or highly prepared to integrate people with disabilities into worship and ritual, and even less so in religious education or service or leadership roles. So that's a thing that often keeps it off people's radars is they've never really heard or thought about this. And the same is true when we think about the service system side of things, where there's often restrictions placed around people with developmental disabilities in our publicly funded residential and direct support among direct support service providers that make them sometimes reluctant or resistant to supporting the spiritual needs of those they serve. And so on the outside of the faith community, they lack the supports to ever arrive at that faith community of their choice. But I will say, as many of you know from the stories you tell and hear, that there are examples of deliberate exclusion, wounding remarks, penetrating stares, refused supports, revoked invitations, denied baptisms, referrals elsewhere. These are all among the testimonies about how faith communities have responded to the presence of people with disabilities. Stories of extravagant welcome, stories of deep wounding. And you see that in the quotes, the above quote of a woman with physical disabilities who just said, when I started first going to the Orthodox Church and found out that we had a healing service, I was like, crap, here we go. Someone's going to try to heal me or something. And that's sort of these underlying things that still persist. So in response to that, over time, new spaces and programs were created in our communities for children and adults with intellectual disability to learn and work and live and recreate. But the opportunities were often provided in separate settings apart from anyone else who didn't have a same label. Separate schools, sheltered workshops, group homes, or institutions that were in hidden corners of community. And those are the de facto choices made without ever meeting you, and sometimes the only choice. So that means in communities, many people still live life away from people with intellectual disability. And the same thing has happened in churches as well, and other faith communities. Their response has been to establish new ministries designed specifically or even only for those with developmental disabilities. That might be small groups for adults with cognitive impairment that are held outside of the usual times or days for religious education. Or other congregations have formed partnerships with local group homes and disability organizations to establish weekday Bible studies or social gatherings or to host day programs. And another approach has been to launch separate worship services that are designed to be more welcoming and accessible for those with disabilities more than traditional services, but often end up only drawing people with disabilities and their families and support providers. Others host once a year kind of special needs proms or other recreational events in which everyone who doesn't have a disability is a volunteer or staff. We're doing an ongoing national study of churches that have intentional ministry related to disability. We talk about the facets of their ministry, and we finished interviewing 200 churches in 48 states. What I put up on your screen is just an early snapshot of that. We found that this is the yellow or gold is the percentage of faith communities that offer these events. So almost half, 47%, offer at least one of these four options: separate Bible studies, separate worship services, separate special needs proms, separate social events. And these emerge for a variety of reasons. Sometimes churches are just adopting practices that they see elsewhere in their community because they see segregated approaches to schooling or employment or recreation all throughout their city or county around the world. And other families advocate for these approaches. And in fact, we also have pastors and ministry leaders who, as you approach them, are beginning with this assumption that the needs of those with developmental disabilities are strikingly different from those of others in their congregation. And so they perceive that different approaches are designed for people who are considered to have different needs or special needs. But often it's just that these programs are born because the rest of the church just remains a little resistant to altering their practices in ways that widen their welcome. Well, we've seen progression throughout the 80s and the 90s when the shift in our service system was towards integrating people within the ordinary aspects of community life. So schools and businesses and residential and recreation programs all started to expand considerably, but so many of the opportunities that have grown in those communities still involved a certain separation. So if you went in schools, you'd find self-contained classrooms. In companies, separate work enclaves, or larger group homes that place people with developmental disabilities near, but not really among others without disability in their community. And the same pattern emerges in our faith communities. more and more faith communities are taking steps to integrate individuals with intellectual disability into the ordinary experiences that comprise their congregation. But often this involves establishing formal and usually kind of named programs focused on promoting access to worship and learning and service. This is ministry among people with developmental disabilities. And you can kind of see how this attention has emerged if you look at this kind of cumulative graph. Basically, it shows the years in which the churches that we've interviewed in our study first launched intentional formal ministry. The very first church we interviewed was way back in 1966, but you can see it was a slow growth until around 2000, and then boom, there's been an explosion of congregations being intentional about creating some kinds of supports for adults and children and youth. And those adults, those supports actually take a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's specialized classes for children and youth and adults with intellectual disability that are kind of the alternative to standard Sunday school classes available to members without disabilities. They might use different curricula or combine a wider age range of ages, or have smaller ratios of leaders and volunteers to participants. About half of all congregations that we've interviewed that have intentional ministry offer one or more of these different options. And of course, sensory rooms are also becoming much more common, which can be a great support, but sometimes it can end up just being a separate classroom as well. My point in all of this is that when we're only focused on integration, then people are present within their faith community at the same time as other members, but a certain degree of distance kind of remains. People with disabilities may be among one another with and without disabilities, but not always being near one another. And this is more common as congregations get larger, because that's how they serve everyone, by groups and subgroups and subgroups. And often we see in congregations integration intermingling with inclusion. So in other words, people are part of some church events, but apart for others. And I think the things that are leading faith communities in this direction are the same that might lead them to separate ministries. They're uncertain about how to adapt the way they worship and teach and gather to enable that wider participation, or because people are just reluctant to make those changes. And a lot of the ministries are begun by special educators or service providers who are then modeling the approaches they're seeing in other areas of their school or community. But sometimes I think there's this underlying belief that that an intellectual disability is the most kind of like salient characteristic by which to group people, or that faith formation is best supported within a specialized setting. And I think whether that's true ought to be more closely examined. So that takes us to the present day, where our focus is now fixed on the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in the same schools and colleges and community groups and recreation programs and workplaces as anyone else. This is what we're doing as service systems, focusing on inclusion. And in faith communities, it's the same kind of movements. It's about ensuring that people with developmental disabilities are encouraged and supported to participate in the same breadth of valued experiences as anyone else. And so it's this posture shift from ministry among to ministry with people with disabilities. And it requires all kinds of things of casting a vision and equipping leaders and volunteers and promoting awareness and adopting person-centered approaches, individualizing support, encouraging flexibility, and just reflecting regularly and remaining intentional. So as people with and without intellectual disability share their faith and their friendship, and they exchange care and companionship, then those congregations tend to pull further away from practices that prevent those kinds of exchanges. In other words, inclusion actually starts to lead to more inclusion. And it's not just that, though. In smaller congregations, inclusion is practically the only option, in a sense. It's the only alternative to exclusion. Rather than talking about disability ministry, those smaller congregations just talk about supporting Kendrick or Aaron or Eliza to just be part of all that faith community offers. And finally, the last of these 5 portraits that we think about from both of these sides of the door is belonging. And we all want to be part of communities where we are seen as indispensable. That's no less true for people with intellectual disability. To be parts of communities where people are seen in fundamentally different ways. It's not those who are labeled and those who aren't, those who get to be the members and those who are guests or strangers, but as one diverse community where every person has incredible, immeasurable worth and value, where everyone is known and accepted and needed. But those communities are also ones that don't just welcome people's presence. They do more than share space. They get people involved in each other's lives, and people get knitted together. And they remain in each other's lives after the school bell rings or after we clock out of work or beyond the benediction. And that's communities where people are befriended and supported and loved. So it's what we want in communities, and faith communities aspire to be these places where believing and belonging abound together, where every person knows they belong to God and belong to one another. So these are the current landscapes of our communities and of our congregations. For you, these may be places, portraits to celebrate, or portraits to figure out how you move beyond. And again, this is not past history, it's living history. And we can go throughout our communities and see examples of all of these. How do we help more faith communities become places of true inclusion and deep belonging? And what are the roles of both service systems and congregations in that effort? And so what is it that's standing in the way of adults with developmental disabilities being included and experiencing belonging in the faith community of their choice? And what is it that's keeping congregations from experiencing the reciprocity and the richness of being this part of this community? Well, there are barriers that abound on both sides of the congregation door. If you talk to service providers, and many of you are direct service providers, you kind of hear a lot of different responses when people ask about faith community inclusion. They say things like, well, I don't know how to address it, or I feel really uncomfortable addressing it, or I never really thought about it, or I don't have time to address it, or, well, it's not my responsibility to address it, or I'm not allowed to address it. We just lack the staff to do this, or, someone else is taking care of it. Or I hope this isn't the view, well, that's just not relevant to people with complex communication needs or disabilities. But barriers also reside on the congregation side. Barriers of awareness and attitude and architecture and activities and communication and expectations and resources and training and theology and many, many, many more. We don't have time to unpack all of those. And so we have to figure out a way of moving through those barriers on both ends, from both directions, so at the end of the day, people can be part of communities in the way they want, and they can share their gifts and friendship and faith in community with others. So how do we do that? Well, 8 kind of key actions came to mind as I was preparing for this webinar, ideas for changing that landscape as it is. And what I'd like to do is take them one by one. And I'm going to talk through each through these 2 lenses of service systems and congregations. And the first of these, where we can begin, is with responding. How do we spur our service systems and our faith communities to move away from that place of overlooking or ignoring this area of inclusion, to be more intentional, to adopt more sustained efforts in some way? Well, direct support professionals who work in disability fields actually rarely receive formal preparation on navigating this dimension of people's lives. And I wonder if that's true for many of you who are on this webinar. Have you received kind of the training and guidance? But they do participate in training about person-centered planning and individualized supports. And they're steeped in values and the importance of self-determination and community inclusion and natural supports, cultural competence and quality of life. But they lack the confidence or the guidance on how to apply knowledge about these things on the screen to this area of spirituality and congregational participation, especially when the person they're supporting's preferences or backgrounds or religious traditions are very different from their own. And the same can be true, of course, with faith community leaders who have the sense of hesitation or uncertainty. I'd commend to you Bill Gaventa's book, Disability and Spirituality, that really unpacks the service system perspectives on this. And I put that in a link within the handouts as well. But understanding and honoring these spiritual beliefs and the commitments and resources of people with disabilities is advocated as best practice. There are a number of national organizations that have very strong statements about religious participation and spirituality, including the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and the ARC, that have crafted these joint statements about asserting spiritual expression as a fundamental right and articulating a strong rationale for providing supports in this area so it doesn't get overlooked. The same is true for TASH, which is another international organization that advocates for human rights and the inclusion of people with disabilities. They talk about the right of individuals with disabilities to participate in spiritual expression or organize religion as they so choose, and then promoting the provision of any and all supports needed by people with disabilities to participate. Of course, the challenge is putting these position statements into actual practice. That's almost always our challenge. So there's a call on service providers, but there's also a call on faith communities. Now, there's different catalysts for faith communities. They're not thinking about the legal mandates or the policy mandates or about research-based practices. Those are the things that spur change in communities. But for faith communities, it's often the call to be more inviting and inclusive of people with disabilities. That comes from sacred scriptures and theological reflection and specific religious tenets and traditions, to love your neighbor, to welcome the stranger, to upend, societal hierarchies, to see every person as indispensable, to move the margins to the middle, to widen our welcome, to pursue the unpursued, to see the image of God in every single person. And it's not just sort of in the scriptures as well, it's also makes its way into the resolutions and statements of so many different denominations and religious traditions. These are just a sampling of those. You can see a full list in the handouts that I put. But the churches that we've talked with this last year as part of our national study, they talk about this commitment to inclusion being grounded in core theological beliefs, not in sociological movements. And they often say that the absence of asterisks or exceptions in their scriptures is what leads them to wonder why it would be any other way than inclusion. And so we want to know that starting point and think about how do we make the case for movement in this area from the vantage point, the very different vantage points of service systems and faith communities. Well, as they both start to awaken to what might be a new area of consideration for them, we see service systems and congregations having to invest in really thoughtful and collaborative reflection. There's actually no single pathway for moving forward. This is actually never recipe work for faith communities or service systems, because every person that we support is different. And the culture and the history and the commitments and our starting points as organizations and congregations are also very different. So you have to figure out what is your particular starting point. So for those of you working within disability service systems, let me just encourage you to reflect on these 4 questions that are some organizational level, some are personal. But how does your organization support the spiritual expressions of those you serve? Is this dimension of people's lives acknowledged and considered or even supported and honored? And how are you addressing spirituality within your person-focused planning? Is it on your radar? And what are your own views regarding spirituality and supports? Because so often those views shape sort of how you move in light of supporting others. What are your backgrounds and beliefs, and how might that introduce biases in terms of whether or how you support the beliefs of others? And finally, how are you seeking input from local faith communities on your supports, right? In other words, how can you invite the input of local congregations on how the supports you provide could better enable participation? I think there's also a place for reflecting as an organization or agency as a whole, to reflect on the principles and the policies and practices that you have related to spirituality and services and supports. On your screen and the next screen are just different indicators that you might look at as you reflect at your own organization. And these will also be fully in a handout that are already posted online. But how well are the roles and responsibilities of DSPs in this area clearly defined and communicated? To what extent does staff know whether and when and how to ask about the spirituality and support needs of the people they serve? How confident are they in providing direct support or making connections to local faith communities? Do they know where to go if they have questions or need guidance? And how familiar are people with disabilities and their families with your organizational commitments and practices related to this area of spirituality? On the screen is just a tool that you can use to kind of guide your discussions in your agency. And again, this is available to download, but I would encourage you to involve leadership and staff and people with disabilities and families and even other community partners in this kind of reflection process, so that you're getting those multiple vantage points. And this is a place where the input of local congregations could be really helpful for you. Now, that importance of reflection also extends to the more than 350,000 places of worship across the US, every one of which is very different in their beliefs and priorities and histories and memberships. And so the ways in which each of them are going to move in this area is going to vary from one congregation to the next. So for you or congregations, ask yourself, what are our prevailing postures and practices of our congregation related to disability? What are the opportunities and supports that we need to expand or even newly develop? And what are the needs we're hearing from members or seeing in our community? What are people with disabilities in our faith community telling us, and what are the needs that are right in our midst? And how could we seek input from service providers on how we might move better to widen our welcome? If we don't really know what it means to be truly accessible, there are people in service systems who do as well. That last question to me is really important because we so often struggle to see our own faith communities from the lens of the stranger or the not yet arrived. So we declare that we're a welcoming place for all, but we don't realize that we're really often just saying that it feels welcoming to us, to those who are already gathered, as this cartoon illustrates. So rather than adopting a prescribed set of actions, faith communities should undertake a process of collaborative reflection where they think about the existing barriers and pressing needs and available resources and the kind of destinations they hope to go to that are specific to their faith community. And there are a number of fantastic existing tools that you can already draw upon. So I put these in a table. These reflection approaches that are available to you focus on either architecture and accessibility, or on personal attitudes. What are the attitudes in my congregation? On indicators of welcome, the tangible things we do that communicate welcome, about our congregation's commitment as a whole, about dimensions of belonging and whether we are living that out as a faith community, and about ways we can kind of spur collective action between us and other faith communities and service systems. So I think there's a lot of different reflection approaches because we don't really have consensus in the field around what it means to actually be an inclusive faith community. But each of these approaches, and every one of them, is linked in the handouts. I see, Michael, your comments will post that link in the Q&A as well. But each of those spur you to think about, what are you doing well? What should you be doing differently or more of, or next as you move forward? But there's also a place for faith communities to consider how you might have individual conversations and group-based discussions, and maybe use surveys or other approaches to help you focus on the changes that are needed next that might matter most for your particular community. Well, as you reflect, you're probably going to discover that you need to do a lot more inviting. That's actually the antidote to absence. It's invitation. So for service systems, that inviting might be in the direction of your local faith communities. So you want to ask yourself, how are we as an organization inviting local faith communities to learn about our work and about our mission? Because most faith communities are completely unaware of what residential and employment and other community providers do or who they serve. They simply have no idea. How can you invite them to learn about what you do? And in what ways are you inviting congregations to also share with you about the opportunities and supports they provide to people with disabilities? And again, those of us in the service system, we pass a lot of faith communities on our way to work or shopping or wherever, but we just don't exactly know which of those might be already intentional about welcoming people with disabilities. And there are a lot of those faith communities. In fact, you can actually look up how many are local to you, including their denominations and traditions. For example, Sarah mentioned, Stone works in Monroe County, which is the Bloomington area. There are 144 faith communities in that county alone, 116 in Bartholomew County, where Columbia is located, and 9,000 across Indiana. In my own city of Nashville, we have about 700 million faith communities. Feels like that, I'm just kidding though. But it's also for congregations, there's some inviting that you need to do if people with disabilities and their families aren't present. This is about shifting from a passive posture of kind of waiting for people to arrive to actually an active approach of pursuing people who aren't there. And remember that people who've been excluded in the past may be skeptical. So how does your website and social media communicate your commitment to welcoming people with disabilities and their families? And what are the avenues through which you announce your welcome throughout your city and throughout disability communities? How are you partnering with local residential providers and supported employment agencies and ARC chapters and autism societies and independent living centers and parent networks and county programs, all that have connections to people with disabilities and their families? But more than just announcing, what are you doing to actually invite throughout your city and disability community? How are you personally inviting people to be part of what you do and how you gather? So talk with disability organizations about the best ways to do this. They really know what that looks like to extend those invitations. And then talk with them about sort of the best ways to break through the barriers that are often aimed at protecting people with IDD that sometimes actually just keep them hidden in communities. And so this is where we need each other. And remember, congregations, your community is filled with people with disabilities. I put a star on this map of a community that's a church, and here are all the households that if you left that church and walked throughout the community, that would likely have at least one member with a disability. It's 1 in every 4 doors that we knock on. So how, as a faith community, are you announcing what you do on your websites and social media? But also, how are you personally inviting people so that they know when we say all are welcome, that they know you, they mean you as well too. So that leads us then, of course, to planning. What does it look like to connect people with IDD to their local faith communities, or for you in the congregations to welcome and weave them into all that you do? Well, on the service system side, thoughtful assessment and planning is really key here. That gives us insights into the goals and needs people have. And informally, I think this just involves listening to people as they share their stories and circumstances, and you discern what's important to them, and you notice references to spirituality or religious involvement, and you follow up with appropriate questions. So here's the questions you can reflect on. What are the questions we're already asking of the individuals and families we serve regarding religious involvement? And how do our planning tools address and capture this information, if they do at all? Is your planning always individualized to people and contextualized to places, one person at a time, one place at a time? And are you inviting insights from congregation members who may already know the people you serve, assuming they want that kind of involvement? They can give you insights about what they're learning about how to provide better supports. So some of those questions, I think formally, there's structured questions that you can ask that address people's spiritual practices and beliefs and congregational involvement. And you might ask how these each of these areas might be addressed in services that you provide, or if they even want them addressed. So these are just examples of questions that you might be adapted to explore a person's spiritual practices, or examples of questions that could be adapted to explore their involvement in local congregations, or even questions that speak to each person's support needs in those areas. And of course, with all good assessment, they have to be individualized and adapted when used with people who have significant cognitive or communication challenges. So if you are doing that intentional planning, you may discover the guidance and assistance and services people with disabilities are going to need to explore aspects of their spirituality, anew or for the first time, to connect to a congregation or other spiritual activities, or to maintain their current practices and involvement in a local faith community, or even to find ways of deepening that involvement, to go deeper than just mere attendance. And for some, about supports to change their practices or change where they go to a faith community. And some you're going to discover this is just not an interest for them at all. And so now you're avoiding that proselytizing as well. So the individualized planning is also critical for congregations. Ask yourself, what questions are we asking of the individuals and families with disabilities who attend our congregation? How are we intentional about planning for their presence and participation? Are we making sure our support is individualized and in context specific to each part of faith community life? How are we involving clergy and ministry leaders and other members of congregations, the congregation in congregation-wide planning? And are we inviting insights from outside professionals who know disability and individuals well as families? And there too, there's some wonderful support plan examples that you can draw upon that are aligned to faith community involvement. I put a few on your screen, and these are full versions are downloadable elsewhere, but they just simply identify what aspects of being of a faith community are important to them, and then the accommodations and modifications and supports they need to participate meaningfully. Well, that takes us, of course, to support. The absence of support further limits the involvement of people with disabilities in worship and learning and service and social activities. So for service systems, how are we informing people with disabilities we support and their families about available options in the community? Are we able to share with them information about welcoming and supportive congregations, or religious ministries that serve the disability community, or spiritual programs that are inclusive and accessible? And that might help them see opportunities that they didn't even know about. Are we providing transportation to congregations that individuals actually want to attend, not just where the group has to go? Are we accompanying individuals who need and want our assistance to those activities? What kind of personalized guidance and support are we going to share with the congregation about how best to support this individual? And are we regularly revisiting those supports over time? Here too, we have an example of a planning tool that you can use that kind of addresses these different areas of support. Down the first column, it lists different aspects of congregational life. So worship services, religious education, small groups, fellowship activities. And then across the top row, it asks what involvement would he or she like, what supports are needed to make this happen meaningfully, and who will provide those supports and how. And so there's just different pages of these that you again might develop and revisit as a plan for making sure that support is available to individuals in their congregations. But the absence of support also limits the involvement of people with disabilities in all aspects of the faith community. And so many people with disabilities will benefit from just the ordinary supports that are available to anyone in the congregation. Well, they provide transportation to others and mentor others and create accessible materials, but others will have to be more intense and individualized and long-lasting. So how well are we as a faith community anticipating the kinds of needs that people might have and soliciting their actual input on what those needs are? And are we aware of the potential ways of actually supporting people with disabilities in our faith community that maybe other faith communities have already discovered? We have a wonderful guide of that outlines supports that families say would be really helpful for their sons and daughters with developmental disabilities. Things like having congregational advocates and disability awareness efforts and respite care or support plans or adaptive worship services or financial support or transportation and on and on. In each of these areas, there's a gap between what families say would be helpful and the actual availability of the supports. And you can download a guide that unpacks every one of those supports, how to deliver it, and what it looks like and why it matters. And of course, congregations also have to think about supports in the area of worship. What are we doing to make sure our worship is accessible in terms of architecture or attitudes or the way we communicate information or the way we have people with disabilities serving and contributing, our expectations for behavior, our interactions with other people, the liturgy and the predictability of that, the mindsets that just exist in our congregation about inflexibility and others, the sense of community that people experience in our worship services, sensory issues, the individualized supports, the ways we make complex information understandable to those with cognitive disabilities, and the ways we provide transportation to and from events. So we've learned a lot about how to provide supports in worship. And in fact, there are many things that churches that we've interviewed that have intentional disability ministries do in the area of worship in terms of support. Now you can review these in your handouts, but each of the gold bars is the percentage of churches that we interviewed that actually offer any of these aspects of support in worship, or supports to families, for example, like respite care and small groups and counseling and classes and marriage retreats and practical supports, and even opportunities for supports they provide between Sundays around employment and day programming and recreation and others. So there are supports out there that you can learn from other faith communities or even from many disability ministries that support congregations. Well, 6 relationships then are the defining feature of what makes a faith community a place of belonging. And we want people to not just be present in a faith community, but to have a presence in those communities. Because being known and needed and loved are core elements of belonging that you only experience within the context of personal relationships. So as service systems, how are we introducing the people we support to others who attend or lead in the congregation? Are we introducing people by their strengths and gifts and talents and interests? And how are we connecting people to others who share their interests and experiences in common? And how are we supporting opportunities for people who meet at church to get together between Sundays? Like, what are all the steps a person has to actually take to spend time with someone that you support throughout the week? Sometimes that's very challenging. And then on the congregation side, we also want to make sure we're focusing on befriending. Sometimes congregations really introduce intentional programming around social relationships, but reflect on these kinds of things. Like, how are we as a faith community supporting participation in all aspects of what we do? Because that's where people meet one another. And how are we intentionally designing fellowship opportunities where people can meet one another and connecting people around interests in common over time? That is the recipe for friendship, getting together with people around shared activities, around common interests over time. And how well are we communicating with direct support providers and others about the events and activities in our faith community so they're aware of the supports that might need to be in place? And then there's partnering. I think faith communities can be strong allies in our service systems efforts to foster self-determination and community inclusion and quality of life among people with disabilities and their families. And service providers can be strong allies in helping faith communities be more inclusive and welcoming. So there's all kinds of things that disability agencies and organizations can do to invite local congregations to participate in efforts addressing pressing needs like employment, or affordable housing, or accessible transportation, or social integration, or health disparities, or others. And there are ways to do this really well. But congregations need invitations and guidance to stretch into these new spaces. And you can help them see that you have connections and resources and relationships that we could tap into that help people flourish all 7 days of the week. If you're not familiar with the putting faith to work model, it's just an example of how faith communities can address the employment needs of people by coming alongside their members with disabilities and identifying their gifts and passions and sense of calling, and then networking through congregation members to find a business that needs exactly those things. We've got a free manual on how to do that as well. And I would just say that the same questions apply to faith communities. Your congregation is filled with people who are actually experts or could help in all of the areas on your screen. It's filled with employers and people who know about housing, people who could provide transportation, people who could be friends who have common interests as well. So as I think faith communities become more invested in inclusive practices, they start to also see kind of the societal and structural barriers that keep people with disabilities from flourishing. And so some congregations actually step into advocacy in partnership with local disability agencies to work for greater community access or legislative or policy changes. And the last action I'll mention, which you never thought I would get to, is that we've got to celebrate all along the way. This is long haul work. It takes time and creativity and vulnerability and partnerships. And so you've got to celebrate along the way what you can, the things that are going well, the opportunities that open up, the things you want to keep doing. Celebrate those and continue with the work to go deeper. So let me end where I began, by inviting you to reflect and respond on the communities that you care most about. And as you look at these different portraits of community, ask yourself, which of these portraits resembles the congregations in your midst, your congregation or the ones in your community? But also ask yourself, which of these portraits of community most closely describe the experiences of the people with disabilities you support in your service system? And what can you do better or more of or differently to move further along in this journey? So thank you for being part of this webinar. I know there's a lot that I threw out, but there are resources for every single component of this. I hope you'll find some elements of strategy you can use. And as Sarah said, we're both open to receiving emails later if there's additional guidance that you need along the way. So check out those handouts, and thank you for being part of this gathering.
Thank you all for being here. I want to point out a few other things. So I want to highlight Erik's book. You can tell I use it a lot as it's tabbed and dog-eared and written on and all that. It is Including People with Disabilities in Faith Communities, a guide for service providers, families, and congregations. And I'm going to put that, there you go, a link to purchase that book right now on Amazon. The other thing I want to point out, if you are local, so in local or around local to Bloomington, Indiana, we have a building belonging program, and that the point of this program is to go through this whole process, this assessment, reflecting, planning and building and applying stages. And so we do this together as a group of faith communities and Stone Belt, and include people with disabilities and their voices in the process of this reflecting, assessing, planning, and implementation. I am also, if you are again local, I am also available for consultation to help you and your congregation throughout in the process of any of this. And I also want to speak specifically to our DSPs, our people with those of you who have disabilities yourself, families or other advocates. Please use this material. Like I said, like Erik said, the material, he has a list of resources, and I'll also send that in an email in case you didn't grab that from the chat. These are great tools so that if a congregation doesn't know where to start, you can hand them some of these tools and say, hey, you know, this person really wants to be here. I know some tools to help us get there. Here's a specific specialized plan that we could put together and do for this individual. Or if you have if you are a person with a disability yourself, say this will help me. And I'm wanting to tell you how I want to participate and figure out a plan to make that happen. So any of these tools you can actually hold on to yourself and give to a faith community, you know, in case they aren't aware of it. Let's go ahead and answer one more question. Rachel, I'm a parish pastor and a member of my synod's a disability ministry team. This was phenomenally helpful. Oh, not a question. Well, I'm glad this was helpful for you. So thank you all for being here. Yes, Donna, I will send a link to the recording along with all of the material. That will be emailed to you. I ask that you give me maybe a week or two, and then I can give you all of those links at the same time. Thank you all for coming, and blessings to you.